He signed the divorce papers without looking up. Damien Ashford's pen moved across the page like he was signing a business contract. Calm, deliberate, utterly without remorse. His attorney sat across the mahogany table, eyes carefully neutral. His two senior advisors stood near the window, and one of them, Marcus Hale, the man who had served beside Damien for 11 years, allowed himself a small, satisfied smile he didn't bother to hide. Across the table sat Evelyn. She hadn't cried. She hadn't argued. She hadn't done any of the things a woman in her position was supposed to do when her husband of 7 years handed her a document that erased her from his life. She simply read each page slowly, her hands perfectly still in her lap, her face carrying the particular stillness of someone who had already grieved something long before the official moment of its death. She picked up the pen. She signed. She removed her wedding ring, a 5-carat piece that had once been described in a society column as the most beautiful ring in the city, and set it on the table without drama, without ceremony, without a single word. Then she stood, lifted a single suitcase she had already packed and left by the door that morning, and said the only thing she said during the entire proceeding. "One day you'll realize you divorced the only person standing between you and your grave." Damien finally looked up. He almost laughed. He caught himself and settled for something worse, a slow, dismissive shake of his head, the kind a man gives when he's decided someone is no longer worth his full attention. Evelyn walked out into the rain. She did not look back. And if you think you know how this story ends, if you think you've seen this kind of story before, I'm asking you to stay with me. Because what happened in the 53 minutes after that door closed behind her is something that none of the men in that room, none of the people who spent years underestimating Evelyn Sterling, were prepared for. Not even close. If this story already has your heart beating a little faster, hit that like button right now and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you're new here, subscribe and turn on notifications, because the stories we tell on this channel don't let go of you easily. Now let's go back to the beginning, because to understand what happened on that rainy Thursday night, you need to understand the 7 years that came before it. The first time Damien Ashford saw Evelyn Sterling, he thought she was someone's assistant. This was not an insult, exactly. It was simply the conclusion a man like Damien reached when he encountered a woman who didn't perform. She stood near the back of a room full of people who were performing. Men in suits that cost more than most people's cars. Women draped in jewelry that announced their value before they opened their mouths. Evelyn wore a plain dark dress. No jewelry except small gold earrings. She held a glass of water, not champagne, and she was watching the room with an expression that Damien later described privately as the most unsettling thing he'd ever seen on a woman's face. Not cold, not calculating, just aware. Profoundly, quietly aware. He crossed the room because he was curious. He stayed because within 4 minutes of conversation, she said 3 things that no one had said to him in years. One observation that was accurate, one question he couldn't immediately answer, and one joke so dry and unexpected that he actually laughed. A real laugh, not the performance he usually gave at events like this. He found out later that the event was a charity gala hosted by a foundation he'd never heard of. He found out even later that Evelyn had organized it, that she had personally vetted every attendee, that the foundation, quiet and unassuming as it appeared, had moved more money into legitimate infrastructure projects in 3 years than some governments managed in a decade. He didn't find any of that out from her. She never mentioned it. That too should have told him something. They were married 14 months after that first meeting, in a ceremony that society columnists described as surprisingly understated for a man of Damien Ashford's profile. There were no 300 guests, no ice sculptures, no orchestra flown in from Vienna. There were 40 people, a civil ceremony, and a dinner afterward at a restaurant that didn't take reservations and that Evelyn had been eating at since she was a child. Damien's inner circle was skeptical from the beginning. Marcus Hale, his chief advisor, the man who had helped him consolidate the Ashford Syndicate's power across 9 states, came to him privately 2 weeks before the wedding with what he called concerns. "She's not one of us," Marcus said. He said it carefully, like he was offering a kindness. "I've done the background work, Damien. She's quiet in ways that don't add up. People who've worked with her don't talk much about her. That's either very good or very bad." "Which do you think it is?" Damien asked. Marcus took a moment. I think she's the kind of woman who knows how to make herself invisible when she wants to. And I think you should ask yourself why a woman like that would want to. Damien dismissed it. He was, at that point in his life, a man who had survived 3 attempts on his life, built an organization that controlled more legitimate and illegitimate capital than most small nations, and operated for 15 years on the principle that his judgment was his most reliable instrument. He trusted his read of people. He trusted his read of Evelyn. He was right about some things. She was steady in ways he had never encountered in a partner. When the pressure was worst, when rivals were moving against him, when federal investigators were circling, when members of his own organization were whispering, Evelyn didn't panic, didn't demand reassurance, didn't retreat into fear. She made tea. She asked precise questions. She offered occasionally a single observation that cut through whatever fog of anxiety or anger he was drowning in, and that observation was always, without exception, correct. He didn't think to wonder why her observations were always correct. He didn't think to wonder how she always seemed to know, slightly before he did, when a situation was turning dangerous. He didn't think about it because she never drew attention to it. She never said, "I told you so." She never asked for credit. She simply was there. Steady, quiet, present. And over time, that steadiness began to feel, to the men around Damien, like absence, like passivity, like a woman who had nothing to contribute except her calm. Marcus was the first to say it out loud, and he said it the way you say something you've been holding back for a while. She's not an asset to you, Damien. She's a liability. She doesn't understand this world. She can't navigate it. And one day her ignorance is going to cost you in a way you can't recover from. Damien didn't agree, not immediately. But he heard it. And once you hear something like that, spoken with conviction by someone you trust, it takes root in a place you don't always have access to. It lives there quietly. It grows. The second year of their marriage, Evelyn had a miscarriage. She didn't tell Damien until 3 days after, because he was managing a crisis and she didn't want to distract him. When she finally told him, he was sitting at his desk going through documents, and he looked up and said, "I'm sorry," with the sincerity of a man who meant it. But then he looked back down at the documents. She didn't cry in front of him. He didn't know, until much later, that she had spent those 3 days alone, grieving alone, managing the physical and emotional wreckage of that loss with the same quiet self-sufficiency she brought to everything else. He told himself it meant she was resilient. He didn't let himself consider that it might mean she had stopped expecting him to show up. The woman who entered the picture in year 4 of their marriage was named Celeste Vane. She arrived through a business introduction, a consultant brought in to help modernize the public-facing side of the Ashford Syndicate's legitimate holdings. She was beautiful in a way that was designed to be noticed, polished, expressive, exactly the opposite of understated. She laughed at the right moments. She had opinions that agreed with Damien's just enough to feel like genuine alignment and disagreed with him just enough to feel like intellectual challenge. She was, in retrospect, a performance so precisely calibrated to Damien's specific psychology that it should have been the first sign something was wrong. Evelyn met Celeste once, at a dinner in the 2nd month of her contract. She shook her hand, made polite conversation, and later that night, when Damien asked what she thought, Evelyn said, "She's very good at knowing what people want to hear." Damien heard it as jealousy. It wasn't. But that's the thing about a perspective that's already been poisoned. Even the truth sounds like something else. Marcus accelerated things in year 5. The whisper campaign against Evelyn became more deliberate, small things, carefully placed. A suggestion that she had been seen meeting with someone from a rival organization. A question raised about a financial transfer that no one could quite explain. Nothing Damien could confront directly. Nothing specific enough to refute, just a steady accumulation of doubt that settled over his view of his wife like a slow fog. And Evelyn said nothing. She could have defended herself. She had the evidence. She had in fact been tracking the campaign against her for almost 8 months by the time it began to affect Damien's behavior toward her. The new distance, the moments of cold suspicion, the way he sometimes looked at her like she was a problem he was calculating how to solve. She chose not to defend herself. This is the thing about Evelyn Sterling that the people who underestimated her never understood, and that even Damien, who had loved her genuinely in his limited and imperfect way, failed to grasp until it was almost too late. She thought in a different time frame than everyone around her. The people around Damien were thinking weeks ahead, maybe months. Evelyn was thinking in years. And the silence she maintained in year 5 and year 6 was not passivity. It was strategy. It was patience deployed as a weapon. She was letting them think they were winning. The final accusation came in month 3 of year 7. Marcus presented Damien with what he claimed was evidence, documents, communications, a financial trail, suggesting that Evelyn had been feeding information to an organization that had made 2 attempts on Damien's life in the previous 18 months. Damien confronted her that night. She sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a coffee mug and listened to everything he said. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "Do you believe it?" "The evidence?" he started. "I didn't ask about the evidence. I asked if you believe it." He looked at her. He thought about 7 years. He thought about the miscarriage she'd handled alone, the crises she'd talked him through, the 100 moments in which she'd been the steadiest thing in a world built on shifting ground. He thought about all of it, and then he thought about Marcus, about Celeste, about 14 months of accumulated doubt. "I don't know what I believe anymore," he said. She nodded once, like that was the answer she had expected, like she had already prepared for it. "Then I think we both know what comes next," she said. She was right. The papers were drawn up within the week. Marcus supervised the process with a quiet efficiency that, in a different state of mind, Damien might have found suspicious. But he wasn't in a different state of mind. He was in the state of mind of a man who believed he was making a decisive, rational choice, cutting loose a liability, protecting his empire, moving forward. The signing happened on a Thursday evening in the main study of Blackwood Manor, with rain coming down outside hard enough to blur the city lights. Evelyn signed without hesitation. She removed her ring. She picked up her suitcase. She said her one sentence. She walked out into the rain. The door closed behind her. Marcus exhaled, a long, slow breath that he converted, not quite fast enough, into a cough. Damien's attorney gathered the papers. Celeste, who had been waiting in the adjoining room, appeared in the doorway with a glass of champagne she didn't offer to anyone else. Damien stood at the window and watched the driveway. He watched Evelyn walk through the rain toward the gate, her single suitcase in hand, her pace steady. He told himself he felt nothing. He was lying. The feeling he couldn't name, the sensation that had been sitting at the base of his sternum since the moment she put down her ring, was not grief exactly, and not guilt exactly. It was closer to the feeling of a man who has just heard a sound he can't identify and knows, in some animal part of his brain, that he should pay attention to it. He was still standing at the window 53 minutes later when the sound of engines reached him. Not one engine, not 5, not 10. The sound was a low, synchronized rumble, like something enormous was approaching from multiple directions at once, and it built and built until the crystal in the cabinet behind him was trembling and his own chest was vibrating with the resonance of it. The first car came through the gate, and his security team's radio erupted in voices, all of them talking over each other, none of them making sense. Then the second car. Then the third. By the time the 7th black Rolls-Royce came through the gate, Damien's chief of security was standing beside him with a weapon drawn and a face the color of old paper. "Sir," the man said. "Sir, they're not stopping." They kept coming. 8, 9, 10. Damien pressed his hand against the window glass and watched, and something cold moved through him that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that predated his empire, his power, his carefully constructed certainty about his own judgment. Something that went all the way back to the child he'd been before any of this, a child who had understood, even then, that there were forces in the world larger than anything he could build walls against. 15. 16. His soldiers were on the grounds now, weapons out, and none of them fired because you don't fire at a convoy like this unless you understand exactly what you're firing at, and none of them understood. 21. The lead car stopped precisely at the place where Evelyn was standing in the rain. 22. The driver of the lead car stepped out and opened the rear door with the practiced movement of a man who had done this 10,000 times and considered it an honor. 3 men in tailored black emerged and stood in a line, their posture communicating something that Damien's soldiers, for all their training, recognized instinctively as a different category of authority. And then Damien watched as those 3 men, without being asked, without any instruction, lowered their heads to Evelyn Sterling. Not a nod, not a tilt, a genuine bow. The kind that means something. Behind him, Marcus made a sound. Damien turned. Marcus Hale, the man who had served beside him for 11 years, the man who had supervised the divorce proceedings with that small, satisfied smile, had gone a color that Damien had never seen on a living person's face. "Marcus," Damien said quietly. "What are those cars?" Marcus didn't answer. "Marcus." His voice dropped in a way that had made harder men than Marcus Hale reconsider their choices. "What are those cars?" Marcus finally spoke. His voice came out wrong. Thin, stripped of its usual precision. "They're Sterling Consortium vehicles," he said. Damien looked back out the window. Evelyn was moving toward the lead car now, unhurried, her suitcase carried by one of the men who had bowed to her. The rain fell on her and she didn't hurry. Why would she? When you have 22 Rolls-Royces waiting for you in the rain, you don't hurry. "Tell me what that means," Damien said. Though something in him already understood that he didn't want to know the answer, that the answer was going to cost him in ways that had nothing to do with money or power or territory. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "It means," he said carefully, "that your wife was never who I told you she was." Damien stood at the window and watched the convoy begin to move, all 22 cars, fluid and coordinated as a single organism, carrying Evelyn Sterling away from everything he had made and built and believed was enough. And the feeling in his chest wasn't the feeling of a man who had made a clean, rational decision. It was the feeling of a man who had just made the worst mistake of his life, and knew it. The convoy was gone. The last red taillight disappeared around the bend in the road, and the sound of 22 engines faded until there was nothing left but rain against the windows and the particular silence of a room full of people who don't know what to say. Damien stood at the window for another full minute after the last car vanished. Nobody spoke. His chief of security, a former military man named Breck, who had survived 3 wars and 2 civil conflicts, and who was not, under any normal circumstances, a man who stood still with his weapon half raised looking at nothing, was still standing exactly where he'd been when the 7th car came through the gate. His arm had slowly lowered. His face had not changed. Celeste broke the silence. Of course she did. "Well," she said from the doorway, her champagne glass still in her hand, her voice carrying the particular brightness of someone trying to reframe a catastrophe as an inconvenience. That was theatrical. Damien turned from the window. He looked at her for a long moment. She met his eyes and held them, and kept that slight smile in place. And it was a good performance. It really was. But something had shifted in Damien's chest in the last 53 minutes. Some instrument that he'd stopped listening to years ago had recalibrated, and what he heard when he looked at Celeste Vane now was a frequency he couldn't unhear. "Get out," he said. The smile didn't move. "Damien, get out of my house." He said it without raising his voice, which was, as everyone in that room knew, considerably worse than if he had. "Tonight, now, take whatever you have here and go." She left without another word. Smart enough for that, at least. Marcus hadn't moved from his spot near the wall. He was watching Damien with the careful attention of a man who is doing rapid calculations behind a neutral expression. And he had been doing those calculations since the moment the word Sterling Consortium had come out of his own mouth, since the moment he'd watched the color drain from his own future. "Sit down," Damien said. "I think—" "Marcus." Just the name. Nothing else. Marcus sat. Damien crossed the room and sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The attorney had vanished at some point during the convoy's arrival. Professional instinct. The survival mechanism of a man who knew when to make himself absent. The security team had dispersed. It was just the 2 of them in the study, the rain still heavy on the glass, the divorce papers still on the mahogany table between them. Evelyn's wedding ring still on the table. A 5-carat ring in a room that suddenly felt very empty. "Sterling Consortium," Damien said. "Start from the beginning." Marcus exhaled through his nose. "Damien, what I know about them. Everything you know. All of it. Right now." Marcus looked at his hands. It was the first time in 11 years that Damien had seen the man look at his hands instead of at whatever he was talking about. It was, in its way, more alarming than the convoy. "The Sterling Consortium isn't an organization in the way you'd understand it," Marcus said. "It's not a syndicate. It's not a cartel. It doesn't have territories in the conventional sense. What it has is reach. It has existed in various forms for over 100 years. Intelligence networks, financial infrastructure that runs through banking systems on 6 continents, political relationships that predate most of the governments currently in power. He paused. When I say political relationships, I mean relationships with the people behind the people you see, the people who decide outcomes before the public vote happens. Damien said nothing. 22 cars, Marcus continued, and his voice was losing its steadiness, fraying at the edges like old rope. That's not a show of force from the consortium. That's a courtesy, a formal retrieval, the kind they do for their own. Their own, Damien repeated. Their leadership. Marcus finally looked up. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had been playing a game and had just understood that he'd been playing it on a board he couldn't see. Damien, Evelyn Sterling isn't just connected to the Sterling Consortium. The name isn't a coincidence. I knew there was a connection. I thought it was peripheral. I thought she had walked away from that world when she... He stopped. When she what? When she married you. The rain hit the window. Damien's jaw worked once. He reached out and picked up Evelyn's wedding ring from the table and held it in his palm and looked at it. And if Marcus had been a different kind of man, a more perceptive kind, he might have recognized that expression. It wasn't the face of a mafia boss calculating his next move. It was the face of a man who had just found something he hadn't known was missing and understood, at the same moment, that he'd already thrown it away. The evidence you brought me, Damien said. The documents, the communications, the financial trail. Marcus was quiet. Fabricated. Still quiet. Marcus? His voice dropped an entire register. I need you to understand what happens in this room in the next 30 seconds if you don't tell me the truth. Yes, Marcus said. The word came out flat and stripped. Fabricated. Or, not entirely fabricated, constructed. Real documents with altered context. Real communications with missing pieces. The financial trail was real, but it was hers. Her own organization's infrastructure, which I knew she used for things I told you she was using against you. Damien set the ring down on the table very carefully. Tell me what she was actually using it for. Marcus looked like a man who had swallowed something that disagreed with him profoundly. Protection, he said. She was using it to... Damien, there have been 4 attempts on your life in the past 3 years. You know about 2 of them. The room changed temperature. Say that again. The incident at the Hargrove Summit, 18 months ago. You know about that. Your team intercepted the contract, neutralized the asset, you moved on. But there was one 6 months before that, at the Meridian Club dinner, and there was one 14 months ago during the Castillo negotiations. And there was one... Marcus stopped, visibly steeled himself, continued. There was one 11 months ago that never became an incident at all because it was stopped before it reached the planning stage. Stopped by who? Silence. Marcus. By Evelyn, Marcus said. By Evelyn's network. Her people identified the contractor before the contract was funded, made the problem go away at the source, and she never told you. She didn't tell you because at that point you were already pulling away from her, already listening to me, and she knew if she showed you that she had operatives and intelligence infrastructure that predated your marriage, that she had resources you didn't know about. He stopped again. She thought I'd see it as a threat, Damien said. Wouldn't you have? The honest answer was yes. Damien didn't say it. The honest answer sat in the room with them anyway, taking up space. He stood up. He needed to move. He walked to the window, the same window where, less than 2 hours ago, he'd watched his wife walk into the rain, and put one hand against the glass and breathed. The consortium she comes from, he said. The 22 cars. The people who bowed to her. Yes. She left that world to be with me. Yes. Or she reduced her active role. I don't think she ever fully left. I don't think that's something you fully leave. Marcus's voice was losing its shape entirely now, becoming something formless and exhausted. I've spent 11 years telling you she was the weakest thing near you. I was the one who didn't understand the board we were playing on. Damien turned from the window. Why? He said. Not the mechanism. Not how you did it. Why? Marcus's face went through several things in quick succession. Damien watched all of them. Because she scared me, Marcus said finally. And it came out like a confession that had been locked up for years in a space too small for it. From the day you brought her into this organization, into your life, she scared me. Not because she was aggressive, not because she challenged me, because she was smarter than anyone in that room and she knew it and she never said it. And a woman like that with connections I couldn't fully map, standing that close to you, I didn't know what she'd do with that position. I didn't know whose side she was actually on. She was on my side. I know that now. She was always on my side. I know that now, Damien. The words fell into the room and didn't make anything better. They weren't meant to. They were just words. Accurate, late, insufficient. Damien picked up the divorce papers from the table. He held them for a moment, looking at the two signatures on the final page, his and Evelyn's. Her handwriting was, as it had always been, precise and controlled. His own looked rushed by comparison. He set them back down. Get out of my house, he said. Don't go home. Don't contact anyone in this organization. Don't contact Celeste Vane. Go somewhere I can find you and wait. Marcus stood. And then? And then I'll decide what comes next. Marcus left. His footsteps faded down the corridor. A door opened and closed somewhere in the distance. And then Damien was alone in the study with the rain and the ring and the papers, and the kind of silence that isn't peaceful at all, but is simply the absence of noise. His phone rang 40 minutes later. He didn't recognize the number. He almost didn't answer. He answered. Mr. Ashford. The voice on the other end was a woman's, crisp, professional, with an accent he couldn't immediately place. My name isn't important. I'm calling on behalf of Ms. Sterling. She asked me to tell you that the account holding the Sandoval payment has been frozen and will remain frozen until the situation with the Meridian Group is resolved. She also asked me to tell you that 2 of your current captains, she said you'd know which ones, should be removed from operational roles within the next 48 hours. For your safety. Damien sat very still. She's giving me intelligence. She's preventing casualties, the woman said. There's a difference. She doesn't owe me that. A brief pause. No, the woman agreed. She doesn't. The call ended. Damien sat in the study until 3 in the morning. He didn't drink. He didn't call anyone. He sat and did what he almost never did. He thought backward. Not about what to do next, but about what had already happened. About what he'd been looking at for 7 years without seeing. The Meridian Club dinner that Marcus had described. The attempt on his life that Evelyn had neutralized. Damien cast his mind back 14 months, trying to locate the memory. He'd had dinner at the Meridian Club. He remembered the evening as uneventful. He remembered that Evelyn had called him that afternoon to ask, very specifically, who was attending. He had told her it was an internal dinner, just his own people, no outside guests. She had asked him again, slowly, as if she were giving him a chance to reconsider the answer, and he had told her the same thing, and she had said, "All right. Will you do something for me? Will you take the east exit instead of the main entrance when you leave?" He had taken the east exit. He couldn't even remember why he'd agreed. She hadn't given him a reason, just asked. And he'd agreed the way you agree to small requests from someone who almost never makes them. Someone had been waiting at the main entrance. He hadn't known that. He knew it now. She had known something was wrong, had no way to tell him the full picture without revealing resources she wasn't ready to reveal. And so she had done what Evelyn Sterling apparently always did. She had found the smallest possible intervention that would produce the necessary outcome. And she had made it quietly, and she had never mentioned it again. He sat with that for a long time. At 3:15 in the morning, his head of security, not Breck, his other one, a younger man named Saul, who had been with him 4 years, knocked and entered without waiting, which he only ever did when something was wrong. "We have a situation," Saul said. "2 of our supply routes, the Northern Corridor and the Atlantic Connection, went dark in the last 2 hours. No contact, no explanation. At the same time, the accounts linked to the Forsyth holdings are showing irregular withdrawal patterns. Small amounts, but frequent. 37 transactions in 90 minutes. Damien looked at him. "Which captains run the Northern Corridor?" Saul hesitated. Just a fraction of a second. "Delgado and Park. The 2 captains Evelyn's call had mentioned. The ones she'd said to remove within 48 hours. For your safety." Pull them in, Damien said. Both of them. Tonight. I want them in separate rooms and I want nobody talking to them until I get there. Saul left. Damien was on his feet, moving now, the stillness of the last hours burning off as the shape of the night became clearer. Something had been set in motion. Not tonight, not by the convoy, or the divorce, or the confrontation with Marcus. Something that had been set in motion a long time ago, by someone, for purposes that were only now beginning to surface. He drove to his operations facility on the east side of the city at 3:45 in the morning with 2 cars of security and a bad feeling that sat in his chest like a stone. Delgado was waiting in a room on the 2nd floor, arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who has been dragged out of bed and is not afraid and wants you to know he's not afraid. He was 51 years old, had been with the Ashford Syndicate for 9 years, and had survived more than most men in his position survived. Damien had promoted him twice, had trusted him with the Northern Corridor for 3 years. Damien sat across from him and looked at him for a long time without saying anything. Delgado's jaw was set. The expression didn't change. "When did they make contact with you?" Damien said. The jaw tightened, just slightly. "Don't do the math," Damien said. "Don't figure out what I know and what I don't know, and tell me the version that fits what I know. Just answer the question. When did they make contact?" A pause. A long pause. Delgado's eyes moved. Not to the door, not to the corner, but to a specific point on the table in front of him. The point that people look at when they're deciding whether the truth is survivable. 8 months ago, Delgado said. Damien breathed through his nose. 8 months. 3 months after the divorce proceedings had begun, but 5 months before the papers were signed. They'd been building this before the marriage was officially over. They'd been sure enough of the outcome to start before it happened. "Who?" Damien said. Delgado looked at the table. "Victor," he said. Damien didn't move. Externally. Internally, something happened that he had no vocabulary for. Some violent rearrangement of a fundamental assumption, the kind that you feel physically before you process it mentally. Victor Crane. His second. The man who sat one chair to his left in every meeting, who knew every route, every account, every strategic decision Damien had made in the last 6 years. Who had been, as far as Damien had believed until this moment, the most loyal man in his organization after Marcus. "Victor Crane made contact with you 8 months ago," Damien said. Slow, deliberate, making sure the words were the right words before he said the next ones. "He said things were going to change," Delgado said. His voice had gone flat and tired, the voice of a man who has already decided confession is less frightening than the alternative. "He said your organization was going to be restructured. He said the people who were positioned correctly when it happened would come out ahead. He said your wife was the problem, that she was the reason you were making bad decisions, compromised decisions, that once she was gone, I'd be easier to manage," Damien said. Delgado didn't answer. He didn't need to. Damien stood up. His chair scraped back. He walked to the door and then stopped, one hand on the frame, not turning around. "You've worked for me 9 years," he said. "Yes." And in 8 months, one conversation was enough. Delgado was quiet for a moment. "He said you were going to fall anyway. He made it sound inevitable. He made it sound like—" He stopped. "It doesn't matter how he made it sound. I made my choice. I know that." Damien left without another word. Park's room was down the hall, and Park's account was largely the same timeline, 8 months ago, same contact, same pitch, different details, same architecture. Victor Crane had been working the organization from the inside, quietly, with a patience and a precision that Damien would have admired in a different context. By 5 in the morning, Damien had a clearer picture. Not a complete one. The complete picture had pieces he couldn't access yet, pieces that were moving in places he couldn't see, but clear enough to understand the shape of what had been done and what was being attempted. The divorce hadn't been Marcus's idea. Marcus had been a tool, a useful one, already predisposed by his own fear of Evelyn to be manipulated in exactly that direction, but a tool. Celeste Vane wasn't just a distraction. She was an intelligence asset, planted, gathering information on the Ashford Syndicate's inner workings for years. And the goal, the actual goal, behind the manufactured evidence and the campaign against Evelyn and the slow erosion of Damien's trust in his own wife wasn't to hurt Damien, it was to remove Evelyn, to remove the one element in Damien's world that they couldn't predict, couldn't control, couldn't buy or manipulate or route around. They had spent years engineering the divorce because they needed Evelyn Sterling out of the picture before the final move. Whatever the final move was, whatever Victor Crane and whoever was behind him were actually building toward, Evelyn was the obstacle. She was the only one who could see it coming, and Damien had handed her to them. He was standing in the parking structure below the facility, the cold air of 4:45 in the morning doing what cold air does, when his phone rang again. Same number as before. She knew, Damien said before the woman on the other end could speak. Evelyn knew about Victor Crane. A beat. She's known for approximately 14 months. The stone in his chest got heavier. She knew and she didn't tell me. She tried to tell you, the woman said. There was no judgment in her voice, which was almost worse than if there had been. 3 times, in the 6 months before the divorce proceedings began. Each time the conversation was redirected. Each time the information she was trying to surface was misdirected by people you trusted more than you trusted her. Damien leaned against the concrete wall of the parking structure and looked at the ceiling. She left me intelligence tonight, he said. The accounts, the captains. She didn't have to do that. No. She could have let whatever Victor Crane is planning play out. It would have hurt me considerably. Yes, it would have. Why didn't she? The silence on the other end of the line was not an empty silence. It was the silence of someone choosing their words with the same precision that Evelyn Sterling appeared to bring to everything. Because whatever she may have decided about her marriage, the woman said finally, she hasn't decided to let you die. The call ended. Damien stood in the parking structure for a long time after that. The cold settled in. He was 53 years old, and he had built something enormous out of will and intelligence and a ruthlessness he'd always told himself was necessary, and he had spent 11 years listening to a man who was afraid of his wife instead of listening to his wife. And he had spent 7 years with a woman who had protected him in ways he didn't know about and never asked for recognition for, and he had ended that marriage on a Thursday evening with a dismissive headshake and a door closed in the rain. And she was still sending him intelligence. She was still, apparently, making sure he didn't die. He pushed off the wall. He had work to do. Delgado and Park had to be handled. Victor Crane had to be located. The accounts and supply routes had to be assessed. There were 100 operational things that needed his attention in the next 12 hours. But underneath all of it, running like a current under still water, was a single understanding that had been building since the moment he'd watched that last Rolls-Royce disappear around the bend in the road. He had to go to her, not to ask for his marriage back. He understood, at some cellular level, that he was not in a position to ask for anything from Evelyn Sterling. But because whatever Victor Crane was planning was moving now. The roots going dark, the accounts moving, all of it happening the morning after the divorce, as if the signed papers had been a starting gun. And the only person who had the full picture, who had been tracking this longer and with better instruments than anyone else, was a woman who had just been formally removed from his life. He thought about what she'd said. One day you'll realize you divorced the only person standing between you and your grave. He hadn't laughed. He'd almost laughed, but he hadn't, because some part of him had heard it not as a bitter exit line but as a statement of fact, and that part of him had been paying attention even when the rest of him wasn't. He got in the car. He told his driver to go to the Meridian Hotel, where he would sleep for 3 hours because he needed to be functional, and tomorrow he would find out where Evelyn Sterling was. I was 3 blocks from the facility when his phone rang again. Not the same number this time. One of his financial people, a man named Torres, who handled the legitimate side of the Ashford holdings, and who had, to Damien's knowledge, never called him before 6 in the morning in 4 years of working together. Mr. Ashford. Torres's voice had the distinctive texture of a man who is trying to stay calm and is not entirely succeeding. I need you to know that what I'm about to tell you is, I've triple-checked this. I've had 2 other people look at it. I'm confident in the numbers. Torres. The Castellan Fund, Torres said. The Meridian accounts. The Forsyth Holdings. The 3 infrastructure companies we brought legitimate 3 years ago. A pause. Someone has been systematically moving assets out of all of them for the last 4 months. Small transactions, different routing every time, always below the threshold for automatic flagging. But when you add them up, how much? Damien said. Torres told him the number. Damien heard it and said nothing for a full 5 seconds. The number was not a number that hurt the Ashford Syndicate's operational capacity. It wasn't designed to. It was a number that represented something more frightening than a direct assault. It represented preparation. The kind of preparation you do when you intend to leave nothing behind. Where is it going? Damien said. That's what I can't fully trace yet, Torres said. The routing goes through 6 different jurisdictions and then it just stops. It goes somewhere I can't see. Keep looking, Damien said. And Torres, don't tell anyone else about this call. Not anyone. He ended the call. The car moved through the empty pre-dawn streets, and Damien sat in the back with the weight of the night pressing down from all directions. And he understood now, completely, with no remaining ambiguity, that the thing Marcus had triggered and Victor Crane was executing and whoever was behind them was aiming at was not a simple power grab. It was a demolition. Someone was going to burn down both the Ashford Syndicate and whatever Evelyn Sterling represented, and walk away from the ash with everything. And the only reason Damien was still a step ahead of the fire, the only reason he had 2 captains in custody and a financial trail to follow and even a fighting chance, was Evelyn, a woman he had divorced 9 hours ago. A woman he had dismissed, undermined, abandoned to grief alone in a house full of his people, handed a suitcase and watched walk into the rain. The car stopped at a red light. Damien looked out the window at the wet, empty street, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, longer than he wanted to admit, he felt the particular vertiginous terror of a man who has run out of the one thing he's always relied on. Not money, not power, not leverage. Time. He slept for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Not 3. The phone woke him at 6:47 with a call from Saul, and from the texture of Saul's voice in the first syllable, Damien was out of the bed before the second word landed. Victor Crane is gone, Saul said. His apartment, his car, his secondary location on the waterfront, all of it clean, not packed up clean, cleaned clean, professional wipe. He left sometime in the last 6 hours. Damien was already moving, already pulling on yesterday's shirt because there was no time for anything else, already doing the math. Victor Crane had known, or someone had told him, that Delgado had talked, which meant either Delgado had found a way to communicate from the room he'd been locked in, or Park had, or there was someone else in Damien's operation feeding information out in real time, someone Damien hadn't identified yet, someone still inside. Lockdown communications, Damien said. Everyone talks through Saul only. Nobody uses their regular phones. Already done. And get me a car, not one of ours. Something clean. He was out of the hotel room in 4 minutes. In the elevator, he called Torres. Torres answered on the first ring, which meant Torres hadn't slept either. The routing, Damien said. Where did it stop? I found another layer, Torres said. His voice had the slightly manic quality of a man who had been staring at financial records for 6 hours straight and had found something he wished he hadn't. After the 6th jurisdiction, the money doesn't disappear. It consolidates. It goes into a single holding structure, a shell, very clean, set up 11 years ago. 11 years, Damien said. The name on the founding documents is a proxy, but the proxy traces back. It takes 4 steps, and I almost missed the 4th one, to a company called Hargrove Strategic Partners. Damien's hand tightened on the phone. Hargrove. The Hargrove Summit, 18 months ago. The first attempt on his life that he actually knew about. And now a financial structure bearing the same name, set up 11 years ago, collecting the assets that were being systematically stripped from his own organization. Who owns Hargrove Strategic Partners? Damien said. That's the thing, Torres said. The ownership is distributed across 9 entities. I've identified 6 of them. 3 are clean. They're legitimate investment vehicles, probably being used as cover. 2 are associated with individuals I recognize from your world. I'll send you the names. But the 9th entity, he stopped. Torres. The 9th entity is held in trust, Torres said. The trust beneficiary is listed as E. Sterling. The elevator doors opened. Damien stood in the lobby of the Meridian Hotel and didn't move. Say that again, he said. His voice came out very even. Controlled in the specific way that things are controlled when the alternative is something you can't afford in a hotel lobby at 7 in the morning. E. Sterling, Torres repeated. The trust was established at the same time as the shell. 11 years ago, which would have been, I'm sorry, Damien. I'm just telling you what I'm seeing. 3 years before Damien met Evelyn, Damien walked out of the hotel and into the cold morning air and stood on the sidewalk while his car pulled up. He got in. He sat in the back and he looked at his own hands, and he did the thing he'd trained himself to do in every crisis, the thing that had kept him alive through 15 years of a world designed to kill him. He breathed, and he waited for the first wave of reaction to pass before he let himself think. The first wave was rage. Clean, comprehensive, the kind of rage that doesn't need a precise target. It just needs somewhere to go. He let it move through him and held very still while it did. The second wave was something older and uglier. The specific humiliation of a man who believes he has been comprehensively deceived by someone he loved. It was the feeling of every piece of trust he'd extended in 7 years turning in his memory into evidence of his own stupidity. He let that pass too. Or he tried to. The third thing that arrived was a thought. Small, stubborn, lodged in the back of his mind in a place the rage and the humiliation couldn't quite reach. The call last night. The intelligence she'd sent him. The accounts, the captains, the warning that had come from a woman who had no reason left to protect him. People who are running a demolition operation do not send the target intelligence that helps them survive the first night. He sat with that for 4 blocks. Then he told the driver to take him to Evelyn's estate. He'd gotten the address from a contact at 3 in the morning, a contact who had given it to him with the expression of a man who wanted to register his strong personal opinion that this was a bad idea without being impolite enough to actually voice it. The estate was 40 minutes north of the city, in a part of the county that was technically rural but didn't feel rural. It felt deliberately quiet, the kind of quiet that's maintained, curated, held in place by intention. The gate at the end of the drive had no intercom, just a camera mounted at eye level. Damien's driver stopped. Damien rolled down the window and looked at the camera and said nothing. Let it see him. 30 seconds. 40. The gate opened. He'd half expected to be kept waiting. He'd half expected a room, a message, some emissary who would tell him that Ms. Sterling would see him at her convenience. What he didn't expect was Evelyn herself, standing in the hallway inside the front entrance when the door was opened. Not by a member of her security, but by a woman in a dark suit who held the door and stepped aside and disappeared, as if she'd been waiting there specifically to do that one thing. Evelyn was wearing plain clothes. Dark trousers, a gray sweater, her hair loose. She looked not like she'd slept exactly, but like she'd made a decision sometime in the night about what her face was going to do today, and her face was doing it. She looked at him with an expression that contained a great many things and made room for none of them to be visible. "You found the Hargrove Trust," she said. Not a question. "My financial person did," Damien said. "Come in." He followed her through a hall and into a room that was clearly a working space, not decorated for receiving guests, but filled with the active evidence of someone who had been operating at full capacity through the night. A long table with multiple screens. Documents in precise stacks. 3 people who looked up when Damien entered and then, at some microscopic signal from Evelyn that he didn't catch, gathered their materials and left the room. Evelyn sat down at the head of the table. She didn't offer him coffee. She didn't offer him anything. She folded her hands on the table in front of her in a way he recognized. It was the gesture she made when she was choosing her words with maximum care, when every word was going to carry weight, and she wanted none of them to be accidental. "The Hargrove Trust," she said. Tell me what Torres told you. That your name is on it. That it's been collecting the assets being stripped from my organization. That it was established 11 years ago." He paused. 3 years before we met." "Yes," she said. The word sat there. "Is that it?" he said. "Just yes?" "I'm waiting to understand what question you're actually asking." His jaw tightened. "The question I'm actually asking, you want to know if I set this up," she said. "If the 7 years was a long game. If the divorce was the plan from the beginning." She said it without heat, without defensiveness, with the flat precision of someone identifying the shape of a thing rather than reacting to it. "That's what you want to know. Tell me I'm wrong." She looked at him for a long moment, long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer, which was not the answer he was hoping for, and the rage started moving again beneath his sternum. "The trust is mine," she said. I established it before we met. It has been used for the last 4 months to collect those assets. Both of those things are true." She paused. "The assets are being collected into it because I put them there. Because whoever is behind Victor Crane was moving them out of your organization and into a structure they controlled. And 6 months ago, I identified that structure and I built the Hargrove Trust as a catch. A container that sits inside their routing chain and looks like their destination, but is actually mine. Everything they think they've stolen from you is sitting in an account that they cannot access." The room was very quiet. Damien sat down. He did it slowly, like a man whose legs have made a unilateral decision. He sat down and looked at her and understood that he had arrived here 40 minutes ago with a specific version of events in his head, and that version had just been disassembled with 4 sentences. "You intercepted the theft," he said. "I've been intercepting it for 6 months. Every transaction Torres traced. I traced it first. I rerouted every one." "Without telling me." Her eyes were steady and not apologetic and not warm. "Without telling you. Because by the time I understood what was happening, you had already filed for divorce. Because I had spent 6 months before that trying to tell you something was wrong and being unable to get the information to you through the people who were between us." She stopped, resumed. "And because the only way to catch all of them, not just Victor Crane, not just Marcus, not just the people you can see, was to let it run, to let them believe they were succeeding. The moment you knew the theft was being intercepted, they would have known I knew, and they would have changed the routing, changed the structure, and we would have caught 3 people instead of all of them." "Who is all of them?" Damien said. She turned to one of the screens, pulled up something, turned it toward him. The document on the screen was a network map. Damien had seen network maps, had used them, knew what they looked like. This one was different in scale from anything he'd seen before. It wasn't a dozen names, wasn't 2 dozen. It was a web of entities and individuals that covered the screen in 3 layers, and at the center of it was a name he knew. Raymond Voss. His hand went flat on the table. His body did what his body did with threat. It stilled, it concentrated, it redirected all available resources to the single point of necessary function. He stared at the name on the screen and felt the particular cold of real danger, the kind that's different from all the manufactured versions, the kind that has weight. Raymond Voss was not a name that people in his world said carelessly. Voss was 71 years old, had never been indicted, had never had his name in a news article connected to anything illegal, sat on 3 charitable foundations and 2 corporate boards. Raymond Voss was the kind of man who existed several layers above the visible action. The man behind the men behind the men, the architect whose name didn't appear on any blueprint. Damien had met him twice. Once at a summit 8 years ago, briefly, a handshake and an exchange of 3 sentences that had felt, at the time, like being briefly inspected by something very large and very patient. Once at a private dinner 4 years ago, where Voss had sat across the table and been courteous and asked intelligent questions and said nothing that could be held against him, and where Damien had come home afterward and told Evelyn, he remembered this now, a specific memory surfacing like something dredged from deep water. He had told Evelyn that Raymond Voss was the most careful man he'd ever been in a room with. She had said, "Yes, he is." He had not asked what she meant by that. He wished, with a ferocity that surprised him, that he had asked. "Voss," he said. "Voss," she confirmed. "He's behind all of it. Victor Crane, Marcus, Celeste Vane, the attempts on my life, the asset stripping, the attempts on your life, the manufactured evidence against me, the campaign that convinced you to divorce me, the placement of his people inside your organization, the positioning of those people to execute a simultaneous collapse of the Ashford Syndicate's operational and financial infrastructure." She said it without stopping, without breathing differently, the way you say something you've known for a long time and have organized into a specific sequence so it can be communicated precisely. And the coordinated move against the Sterling Consortium that was meant to happen at the same time. The 2 organizations were supposed to collapse simultaneously. Every asset, every network, every intelligence resource both of us have spent decades building, all of it was going to be sitting there, ownerless, in the aftermath. And Voss takes all of it. Voss consolidates all of it, she said. There's a difference. He doesn't want to run a syndicate. He doesn't want territories or supply chains. He wants the intelligence. He wants the networks, the human networks, the financial infrastructure, the political relationships. Everything that can't be built quickly, everything that took decades. He takes it all, and he becomes the single point of control for every organization that currently has any real power in this country. She paused. He's been planning this for 14 years. Damien looked at the network map on the screen. He looked at the layers of it, the depth of preparation it represented, and he felt the specific vertigo of someone who has just understood the actual dimensions of the room they're standing in and discovered it is much larger than they thought. 14 years ago, he said slowly, you were mid-consolidation. You were building what would become the Ashford Syndicate's primary operational structure. And She stopped. What were you doing 14 years ago, Evelyn? Something moved in her face. Just for a moment, the first crack in the controlled surface. I was leaving the consortium, she said, stepping back. I had decided I didn't want the life I'd been raised into. I had set up the trust, arranged my affairs, and I was going to. It doesn't matter what I was going to do. What matters is that Voss identified both of us as the primary obstacles to what he was planning. The two largest independent power structures that he couldn't absorb easily, couldn't route around, couldn't simply wait out. He needed us gone. And he spent 14 years building the mechanism to make that happen. The mechanism being our marriage, Damien said. She looked at him, not defensively, not apologetically, with the expression of someone who is holding a difficult truth and is not going to be the one to look away from it. No, she said. The mechanism was making you distrust me. The marriage was the complication he didn't plan for. He placed Celeste Vane in your orbit a year before we met. He had people positioned in your organization before I was in the picture. The original plan didn't involve me at all. It was a straightforward dismantling of the Ashford Syndicate using inside assets and a financial bleed. She paused. Then you and I met, and I came into your world, and for a while, for the first 2 years, the plan stalled. Because I was identifying his moves and neutralizing them before they landed, and he couldn't find the leak. He eventually figured out the leak was you. He figured out I was in the way, she said, and he pivoted. Instead of dismantling you directly, he dismantled your trust in me. Much simpler, much more effective. Another pause. Shorter, sharper. He was right about that part. The last 3 words landed in the room and did not move. Damien said nothing for a long moment. He was looking at the network map, but he wasn't seeing it anymore. He was seeing other things. 7 years of other things. The intelligence you sent me last night, he said. The accounts, the captains. Buying time, she said. If Delgado and Park hadn't been pulled before this morning, Crane's people would have used the northern corridor to move something that would have triggered a federal investigation into the Ashford Syndicate's legitimate holdings. Not just your illegal operations, your clean assets. The ones that have 47 employees and pay taxes and can't survive federal scrutiny even when they've done nothing wrong. She said it clinically, like she was reading from a risk assessment. I needed your organization to stay intact for the next 72 hours. After that, it doesn't matter. After that, Damien said. What happens after that? She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the screen with the network map, and then she looked at him, and whatever she was deciding, she made the decision visibly. He could see the moment of it on her face, the specific quality of a person committing to something they can't take back. There's a summit, she said. Voss has been assembling it for 4 months. It's in 3 days at the Lindqvist compound on the coast. 41 individuals, organization heads, financial intermediaries, political figures who've been on Voss's payroll for years. The stated purpose is a coordination meeting. The actual purpose is a simultaneous transfer of authority. Every organization represented at that table is going to hand control of its most critical assets to a central structure that Voss controls, under terms they believe are negotiated and voluntary, but that are actually coerced, Damien said, leveraged. Every person at that table has something Voss holds over them. Evidence, debt, exposure. They'll sit down and sign documents and believe they're making a strategic partnership, and 3 months later they'll understand what they actually signed. She paused. Except for the 2 that weren't going to be at the table. Us. We weren't invited because we weren't going to be available. You were going to be in the middle of an organizational collapse. I was supposed to be neutralized, discredited, removed from the consortium leadership through a document trail that Voss has been building for 2 years, suggesting I've been operating outside the consortium's mandate and funneling resources into personal holdings. Her mouth compressed for a fraction of a second. The Hargrove Trust was supposed to be his evidence. He built the structure and my name was going to appear in it as the beneficiary of assets stolen from you, establishing that I'd orchestrated the divorce, your financial bleeding, and the move against you for personal gain. He was going to present it to the consortium's board the same day as the summit, using your own name against you. Using a name he put there, she said. I found his version of the trust 6 months ago, and I built mine on top of it, in secret, with slightly better security. Every document he created implicating me. I have the originals and the provenance. Every piece of evidence he manufactured, I have the manufacturing trail. Damien sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling of her working room for a moment, just a moment, and then back at her. You've been building a case, he said. I've been building a case. For how long? 14 months of active building, 2 years of preliminary work before that when I wasn't certain of the full scope. And you didn't tell me, he said. He heard the thing in his own voice. Not accusation, not entirely, but something adjacent to it, something that was trying not to be. I've told you exactly what I could, when I could, through channels I could trust, she said. The rest? No, I didn't. She met his eyes. You want me to apologize for that. I understand why, but I can't, because at every point in the last 14 months, the decision I made was the decision that kept both of us alive. I can live with that. Whether you can is your business. The door opened. The woman in the dark suit appeared, moved to Evelyn's side, and said 2 words in a low voice that Damien was not meant to hear. He heard them anyway. Voss knows. Evelyn's expression didn't change, not a muscle, but her hands, the hands she'd had folded on the table with such careful stillness, shifted. One of them moved to the edge of the table, her fingertips pressed against the surface and then released. It was the only tell, and it was so small that if Damien hadn't spent 7 years learning the vocabulary of her body, he would have missed it entirely. But he caught it. And in 11 years of running an organization built on threat and counter-threat and survival, he had seen enough people receive catastrophic news to understand what he'd just watched cross Evelyn Sterling's face in the space of 2 seconds. Not fear. She didn't do fear, or at least she didn't let it be visible for more than a fraction of a second. What he'd seen was something rare and in its way more alarming, the expression of a strategist who has run all the contingencies and found a gap she hadn't planned for. How? She said to the woman, low, sharp. The Torres call, the woman said. His phone was compromised. The conversation about the Hargrove Trust, Voss's people pulled it within the hour. They know you intercepted the routing. They know the assets aren't where they thought. Evelyn was quiet for 4 seconds. It was the longest Damien had ever seen her go still without being asleep. Then she turned to Damien, and the expression on her face was one he had never seen there before. In 7 years, in every crisis, in every moment of difficulty and grief and tension, he had never seen Evelyn Sterling look at him the way she was looking at him now. Not afraid, not lost, but bare. Like something that was usually housed behind glass had been brought out into the open. He'll move the summit, she said. He knows I've been tracking the preparation. He'll accelerate. The 48 hours I had becomes... She stopped. Did the math. 12. Maybe less. Tell me what you need, Damien said. She looked at him. The bare expression didn't change. I need you to trust me, she said. Not because you understand everything I've done or why I did it. Not because you've forgiven me for the things I kept from you, or because I've forgiven you for what happened last night. I need you to trust me because we have 12 hours, and because Raymond Voss is going to burn down everything we've ever built, and because there is no version of the next 12 hours that either of us survives alone. Damien looked at her for a moment. You haven't forgiven me, he said. No, she said simply. But you're asking me to work beside you anyway. Yes. Why? She held his gaze with the steady I first saw it across a crowded room 12 years ago, the quality that turned out not to be coldness at all, but its precise opposite, a kind of attention so complete it had nowhere to hide. Because you're the only person in this room, she said, who has ever made me believe that the thing I was protecting was worth the cost of protecting it. Outside, somewhere in the distance, the sound of a helicopter approached and grew and then faded, and in its wake, the silence of the estate felt different than it had when Damien arrived. tighter, more pressurized. The silence of a room in which the available time had just been cut by 3/4, and every second that passed now had a specific, irreversible weight. Evelyn stood up. She moved to the screens and began pulling up feeds and documents with the efficiency of someone who is prepared for this exact moment while hoping it wouldn't come. And her team materialized from wherever they had been. 4 people, 5, moving into position around the table with the practiced coordination of people who have worked together for years and don't need to say much. Damien stood. He was 53 years old. He had built something enormous. He had spent 7 years married to a woman whose full dimensions he had never bothered to take, and he had thrown that marriage away in a room with a man who was afraid of her. And now he was standing in her working space 12 hours before the most dangerous deadline either of them had ever faced. He thought about the moment in this parking structure, 4 hours ago, when the word time had arrived in his chest as the thing he'd run out of. He walked to the table. He stood beside her, not behind her, beside her, and looked at the screen she was working from, and said, "Tell me where to start." And Evelyn Sterling, who had protected him for 7 years without being asked, who had sacrificed her reputation and her health and the chance to grieve her own losses out loud, who had signed divorce papers with steady hands and walked into the rain without looking back and still sent him intelligence when he needed it most. Evelyn looked up at him with the expression of someone who had not been expecting that specific sentence, and who did not let herself feel what it cost her to hear it. Not yet. Not now, because there was no time. "The summit location," she said. "Voss will move it. We have maybe 6 hours before he goes dark and we lose the thread entirely, and if we lose the thread—" Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her face did the thing it had done when the woman whispered, "Voss knows." That single second of exposure, the gap in the glass. She showed Damien the screen. The name on the incoming call was one he didn't recognize. But beneath the name, the number had a country code. And the country code belonged to the location of the Lindqvist compound. Someone at the summit site was calling Evelyn. Someone who wasn't supposed to know she was still in the game. Someone who wasn't supposed to know she was still alive, operationally, strategically alive, was calling her direct line, which meant either they were one of hers, reaching out in crisis, or they were one of Voss's, calling to confirm something that made Damien's stomach drop before he could articulate why. Evelyn answered. She listened for 11 seconds. Her face went through nothing. Then she said 2 words and ended the call. She set the phone down on the table very carefully. "What?" Damien said. She looked at the network map on the screen, the web of names and entities with Raymond Voss at the center. She looked at it for a moment with the expression of someone reading something they've read before and finding a new sentence they missed. Then she looked at Damien. "My second in command at the consortium," she said. "The person I trusted most inside my own organization." Her voice was absolutely level. "He's been at the Lindqvist compound for 2 days. His name was Daniel Rourke. 54 years old, silver-haired, the kind of man who looked like someone's distinguished uncle and moved through rooms the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance so naturally that you didn't notice he was always moving somewhere specific. He had been Evelyn's second in command at the Sterling Consortium for 6 years. He had the kind of institutional knowledge that can't be replaced. Relationships, codes, trust built over a decade with people who didn't extend it easily. Damien watched Evelyn's face after she said his name and saw her do what he'd never seen her do before. She stopped. Not paused, not recalibrated. Stopped. For 3 full seconds, the most capable person he'd ever known stood in front of a table full of screens and intelligence and people waiting for direction and simply could not move. 3 seconds. Then she was back. "How long has he been on site?" she said to the room. One of her team, a young woman with close-cropped hair who had been working a secondary screen, answered without looking up. "Flight records show he landed at the coastal airstrip 49 hours ago, 2 days before Voss moved the summit timeline." "Before Voss knew I'd intercepted the routing," Evelyn said. "Yes, so Rourke didn't go there because Voss panicked. He went there because he was already part of the architecture." She said it flat and clinical, and the flatness cost her something. Damien could see it, a small visible expenditure of something she didn't have unlimited reserves of. "Pull everything Rourke has touched in the last 8 months. Every communication, every authorization, every access point. I want to know what he handed them." The young woman started moving. 2 other team members converged. The room shifted into a different gear. Faster, tighter, with the particular energy of people who have just been told the foundation they were standing on has a crack in it and who are choosing, professionally, to keep standing. Damien moved to Evelyn's side. He kept his voice low. If Rourke has been inside for 8 months, he knows the case I've been building, she said. Same low register. He knows the asset structure, the routing intercepts, the evidence chain. He knows I have the manufacturing trail on Voss's documents. Her jaw set. And now Voss knows all of that too. Which means the case you've spent 14 months building is compromised, she said. Not destroyed. Compromised. There are elements Rourke didn't have access to him. Contingency files I kept off the primary system. Physical documents in locations he was never given. She was already moving to a different screen, pulling up something with a password sequence that she entered from memory without slowing down. But the Summit case, the clean, airtight, walk into any room in the world and lay it on the table case, that's gone. So we go in without a clean case. We go in without the case we planned for, she said. We go in with whatever we can rebuild in. She checked the time. 5 hours and 40 minutes. Damien looked at the screen she'd just unlocked. It was a floor plan, a compound layout, large, coastal, with multiple structures and what appeared to be a private dock on one side and a helicopter pad on the other. His eyes moved across it the way they moved across any tactical problem, finding the choke points, the entry vulnerabilities, the places where people funnel when they're trying to move quickly. How many on site, he said. Voss's security, 40 minimum, probably 60 by now if he's accelerating. The summit attendees have their own personnel, but those are status symbols, not operators. They'll have drivers and personal security who are used to standing in hotel lobbies, not... She stopped, looked at him. Something passed between them that was too compressed and too loaded to be a full conversation, but that contained one. Not what this is going to be. Our people, Damien said. What do we have that can move in 5 hours? Consortium operatives. I have 14 I trust completely, 12 more I trust situationally. They can be at the coastal staging point in 3 hours. She paused. Your people. Saul can pull together 20 who'll move on my word. Good ones. He paused. And I have something else. She looked at him. The northern corridor, he said. Delgado's route. Before Crane flipped him, there was a reason that route mattered. It's the only clean coastal access point that doesn't appear on any map Voss would have sourced his intelligence from. It predates the Ashford Syndicate's current structure. It was my father's route. He said it without sentiment, as a tactical fact. Nobody outside of 3 living people knows it exists. Evelyn held his gaze. She was doing the calculation. He could see it, the rapid assessment of a strategic mind working at full speed. And then she nodded once. Compact, decisive. Show it to Saul, she said. Right now. The next 4 hours moved away, extreme time moves, both too fast and with a peculiar, hyper-detailed clarity, so that individual moments were vivid, and the spaces between them compressed into nothing. Damien was on the phone with Saul for 20 minutes, then coordinating with 2 of Evelyn's senior operatives for another 40. The estate's working room became a command structure without anyone formally organizing it. People fell into roles, information flowed in and got processed and pushed back out. Decisions got made in fragments of conversation and confirmed with nods. Evelyn did not stop moving. She rebuilt the case in 3 hours and 40 minutes. Not the full case, she'd been right that the comprehensive version was gone, but a version. A targeted version, stripped to its most essential and most irrefutable components. The original documents Voss had manufactured to implicate her, with their provenance trail showing creation, alteration, and intended deployment. The financial architecture of the Hargrove structure, both Voss's version and hers, laid side by side in a way that showed exactly what had been stolen, exactly where it had gone, and exactly who had authorized each step. And something Rourke hadn't known about, something Evelyn had kept in a physical file in a location she'd told no one. A recorded conversation from 11 months ago, audio only, between Victor Crane and a man she had not been able to fully identify at the time. She played it for Damien at the 4-hour mark, standing beside him at the screen, her arms crossed, watching his face. The voice on the recording, the one that wasn't Crane, was careful and measured and used precise language and had the particular cadence of a man who was accustomed to his words being the last ones in any conversation. Voss, Damien said. Voss, she confirmed. How did you get this? I had a listener in a position Crane didn't know about. It cost me something significant to place them, and I burned the asset pulling the recording. She paused. I've been holding it as a last resort because once I use it, I can't use it again. This is the last resort, Damien said. Yes, she said. It is. They left the estate at 11:47 in the morning. 2 vehicles, clean, unremarkable, registered to entities that didn't exist, carrying Damien, Evelyn, and 4 of her most trusted operatives. The rest of the assembled team was already moving via different routes, converging on the coastal staging point through channels that Voss's surveillance wouldn't be watching, at speeds that were designed to arrive in the right sequence. The drive took 2 hours and 20 minutes. Evelyn spent most of it on encrypted communications, making contact with 3 people whose names she didn't say out loud, and whose responses she listened to with the focused attention of someone reading a situation through very limited information. Damien sat beside her and did the thing that cost him more than any physical demand he could have been given. He stayed quiet and let her work. He watched her hands when she wasn't looking. They were steady. How they were steady, after 48 hours of what they'd both been through, was something he couldn't account for. At the 1-hour mark on the drive, his own phone buzzed. Torres, on a clean line. The Forsyth accounts, Torres said. Someone tried to access them in the last hour. Used the right credentials, right routing. Whoever it was had information that should have been inside your organization. Crane, Damien said, or whoever Crane is reporting to. They get in? No, I moved the accounts at 4 this morning. They hit an empty structure. A pause. Damien, these people are very good. I know. I want to be clear that I'm very uncomfortable with all of this. I know that too, Damien said. Stay on the accounts. Call me if anything moves. He ended the call. Evelyn glanced at him, just a glance, assessing, and then back at her own screen. Crane is still running active operations, Damien said. He'll be at the compound, she said. He'll want to be there when it closes. Men like Crane need to be in the room when the thing they built comes together. She said it without contempt, just as an observed pattern, the way a naturalist identifies behavior. It's a weakness. Is Rourke the same? A brief pause. Rourke is different. Rourke is careful, precise. He'll be somewhere he can observe without being directly exposed. She stopped. He was my second because he thought the way I thought. He anticipated things. He stayed ahead. Then he's anticipated us coming. He's anticipated the possibility, she said. There's a difference between anticipating a possibility and being prepared for the specific form it takes. The coastal staging point was a disused marine facility 3 kilometers from the Lindqvist compound, a collection of low concrete buildings behind a fence that looked long abandoned and wasn't. Saul was there when they arrived, with 19 of the 20 people he'd promised, the 20th being delayed by a road closure that was either coincidental or wasn't. Evelyn's people were already there, 14 of the fully trusted ones, moving with the quiet efficiency of a team that had drilled for scenarios like this and found the real thing clarifying rather than chaotic. Damien watched his people and Evelyn's people exist in the same space for the first time. It was in a low-key and concentrated way, like watching 2 different species occupy the same territory. His people were loud in their silence, the kind of quiet that vibrates with barely contained capacity for violence. Hers were a different kind of quiet, leaner, more deliberate. The kind of quiet that comes from people who have been trained to think 3 steps ahead of the moment they're in. Saul looked at Evelyn's team with an expression Damien recognized as the expression of a man who is recalibrating his assumptions in real time. They're better than I expected, Saul said in a low voice at Damien's shoulder. They're better than you expected because you expected what you'd heard, Damien said. Stop expecting what you've heard. The briefing took 22 minutes. Evelyn ran it. Damien watched her run it and understood, in a comprehensive and irreversible way, that he had spent 7 years living with a version of this woman that was like living with the shadow of something and having decided the shadow was the whole thing. The people in that room, his people included, oriented to her the way people in command structures orient to command. Not because she was loud, not because she demanded it, because she was precise, because her information was better than anyone else's in the room, and because she was absolutely clear about what she needed and why. She gave them the compound layout. Entry points, security positions as of 6 hours ago, with the caveat that positions may have shifted. The location of the main summit room and 2 alternates Voss would use if he believed the primary was compromised. 3 objectives. Ranked, secure the recording's transmission point. They needed to broadcast the Voss-Crane conversation to a set of pre-positioned recipients simultaneously, making suppression impossible. Extract the physical documents from a specific location within the compound's administrative wing and locate and detain Daniel Rourke before he could destroy anything. Raymond Voss himself was not on the extraction list. Damien noticed that. He waited until the briefing was over and the room had broken into preparation cells before he said it. "Voss," he said, "you didn't put him on the list." "No," she said. "Why?" She was checking a communications unit, small, sophisticated, the kind of equipment that costs more than most people's annual salary. She didn't look up. "Because what I'm going to do to Raymond Voss doesn't require being in the same room as him. What I'm going to do to him requires that every person at that summit table sees what he is before they sign what he's put in front of them. That every organization he's planning to absorb understands exactly how they've been leveraged, exactly what evidence he holds and how he obtained it, and exactly what the consequence is of signing versus not signing." She set the communications unit down. "Raymond Voss has spent 14 years building an architecture of control. The most effective thing I can do to that architecture is expose every beam and joint and hidden support to the people it was designed to trap. He doesn't need to be in a room with me. He needs to be in a room full of people who now know the truth." Damien looked at her for a moment. "And if he runs?" "He won't run," she said. "He's 71 years old, and he has never in his life believed that a situation could get away from him. He'll try to control it. He'll try to spin it, reframe it, discredit the source." She finally looked up. That's when the recording plays. They went in at 3:42 in the afternoon, through the northern corridor that had been Damien's father's route, a coastal access point through a shallow inlet that required small, flat-bottom watercraft, and knowledge of the tidal pattern that only existed in the memory of people who had used it for 30 years. Damien's people knew it by muscle memory. Evelyn's adapted to it within minutes, because that was what they did. The compound's perimeter security encountered them at the 4-minute mark on the eastern approach. 2 of Voss's people, good ones, who came out of a blind correctly and moved to intercept with the economy of trained professionals. What they ran into was 6 of Evelyn's operatives who had been waiting for exactly that intercept at exactly that position, because the compound layout had told her where the eastern blind's coverage gap was, and she'd positioned accordingly. It was over in 90 seconds. Nobody fired. That was the discipline, the absolute enforced discipline that Evelyn had made non-negotiable in the briefing. No weapons discharged unless there was no remaining alternative, because the summit room was 140 meters from the eastern perimeter and a gunshot would carry. Damien moved with the second team through the service corridor on the compound's north side toward the administrative wing. His knee was complaining, an old injury, sustained years ago, that declared itself in cold and damp with consistent unpleasantness. And he pushed through it with the blunt internal negotiation that you use with a body that is older than your current plan assumed. His breath was controlled, his hands were steady. He felt, underneath the operational focus, something he hadn't expected to feel, a clean clarity. Not the adrenaline of danger, which he'd had many times and recognized. Something different. The clarity of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and exactly why. They reached the administrative wing at the 9-minute mark. A door that should have been locked wasn't, either an error or a setup, and there was no time to determine which, so they moved through it with the appropriate assumptions and the appropriate caution. The physical documents were in a room on the wing's second floor, in a case that Evelyn's intelligence had said would be accessible through a specific credential. The credential worked. The documents were there, 41 individual files, one for each summit attendee, each containing what Voss held over them. Damien held one of them in his hand for 3 seconds, long enough to understand its contents, and felt the cold comprehension of someone looking at 14 years of patience and cruelty compressed into a manila folder. He handed it to the operative beside him, who secured it with the others, and they moved. The summit room was on the compound's main level, ocean-facing, large enough for 41 people and the support staff Voss had assembled. The session had been called for 3 o'clock, which meant it was already in progress when they hit the perimeter, which meant Voss was talking when the first of Evelyn's communications people reached the transmission point and started the broadcast. Damien was 30 meters from the summit room's exterior wall when he heard the recording start. It played through the compound's own audio system, a detail he hadn't known until it happened, which meant Evelyn had known about an access point she hadn't shared in the briefing, which meant she had kept one element back even now, even from him, and he filed that away for later because there was no time for it now. Voss's voice came through the wall, through the building, clear and precise, and saying things that were not designed to be heard by the 41 people currently sitting in the room where they were being said. 30 seconds of recording. Then a second voice, someone on Evelyn's end, calm, professional, saying, "The documentation supporting what you just heard is being transmitted to your personal devices now. Every attendee at this summit, every piece of evidence, every manufactured document, every financial transaction. You have approximately 4 minutes to review it before Mr. Voss will attempt to address you. I suggest you use those 4 minutes." The noise that came through the wall from the summit room was not one noise. It was many noises, overlapping, voices, movement, the sound of chairs, the sound of a room full of powerful people realizing simultaneously that the ground under them is not what they thought. Damien hit the exterior door at a run. The summit room was exactly what the floor plan had shown. Long, ocean-facing, 41 people at a table that curved in a gentle arc, and a projection system at the far end currently displaying documents that people were also reading on their phones and tablets. Raymond Voss was standing at the head of the table. He was the only person standing. He looked, as Damien came through the door with 4 people behind him, exactly like what he was. A man who has spent 71 years being the most controlled person in every room he occupied, confronting the specific and novel experience of being the least controlled person instead. His face was a mask of composure, but his hands, both of them, flat on the table's surface, were pressing down with the particular pressure of a man who needs something solid to hold on to. His eyes found Damien. Then they moved, and they found Evelyn, who had come through the opposite entrance and was standing at the far end of the room with the contained stillness of someone who has been building to this moment for a very long time. The room went quiet. 41 people at a curved table, 41 people with phones in their hands and documents on screens, and the specific expression of people who have just understood that they were not in a negotiation but in a trap, and that the trap has a different architect than they believed. Voss looked at Evelyn for a long moment. Then he did something unexpected. He smiled, not warmly, not with any pretense of warmth. It was the smile of a man who is showing that he has one card left and who believes it's enough. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice carried through the room without effort. 71 years old, and his voice still commanded space as a matter of physical fact. "You've been thorough. I expected nothing less." A pause, measured and deliberate. "I should tell you that there are currently 4 of my people in a room 2 floors above this one." He let that land. "Daniel Rourke is not in that room," he continued. "Mr. Rourke has been unexpectedly useful in ways that extended beyond the information he provided. He had access, you see, to something I've been searching for a long time." Another pause. "The contingency files. The ones you kept off the primary system." Damien felt the air in the room change. He looked at Evelyn. Her face had done the glass thing, the crack, the fraction of a second of exposure. "He found the physical location 3 days ago," Voss said, "before the divorce, before your husband came to see you, before any of this." He gestured at the room with one hand, a slow, encompassing gesture. "The files are gone, Ms. Sterling. The originals. Everything you had that I didn't know about." He tilted his head. "Which means what you've played in this room today is everything you have." "Is it enough?" Evelyn said. Her voice was quiet, not shaken, but quiet in a way that wasn't her normal quiet. It had a different quality, thinner, as if it was being maintained with slightly more effort than usual. Voss considered the question with apparent genuine thought. The recording, the financial documentation, the manufacturing trail on the evidence. He ticked them off as if reading a list he'd prepared. "Against 41 individuals who signed preliminary agreements before entering this room, documents that predate everything you've played today, and against my own rather considerable resources for shaping the subsequent narrative." He almost shrugged. I think the honest answer is possibly not. The room was extraordinarily still. 41 people at a curved table, not breathing loudly. Damien looked at the 41 faces. He looked at what was in them, not the performance of composure that Voss was maintaining, but the real thing, the raw material underneath, fear, yes, and calculation, and the particular expression of people who are trying to determine in real time which way the floor is going to fall. He thought about what Evelyn had said in the briefing. He thought about 41 files in a case on the second floor of the administrative wing, each one containing what Voss held over one of the 41 people sitting at this table. He looked at Evelyn. She was already looking at him. In 7 years of marriage, in 100 moments of domestic and professional crisis, they had occasionally, not often, but occasionally, understood each other without speaking. It was not a mystical thing. It was simply the byproduct of sustained attention, of two intelligent people who had learned, over time, the architecture of how the other thought. This was one of those moments. Damien turned to the man behind him, the operative who was carrying the documents from the second floor. He held out his hand. The operative put the case in it. Damien set it on the table. He opened it. He did not look at Voss while he did this. He looked at the 41 people at the table, and he placed the files, one by one, in front of each person they belonged to, moving around the table with a deliberateness that had the effect of making the room hold its breath. 41 files, 41 people. When the last one was placed, he stepped back. "What's in those folders?" he said, and his voice came out the way it came out when it mattered, grounded, clear, the voice of a man who has made a final decision and is fully behind it. "Is everything Voss has on each of you. The evidence he's been holding, the leverage." He looked around the table. "It's yours, right now. Take it, and there's nothing left to sign." Voss moved. He moved fast for a 71-year-old man, fast and with the decisiveness of someone who has spent a lifetime acting before the moment for action closes. He reached into his jacket, and Damien, who had spent 30 years in a world where that particular motion meant a specific thing, was already moving before the thought completed. He crossed the distance in 4 steps and caught Voss's wrist before the hand cleared the jacket, and they stood there for a moment. The 71-year-old architect of 14 years of patient destruction, and the 53-year-old man who had been the primary target of it, with about 8 inches between their faces and the quality of the air between them being the quality of something that has been building for a long time finally arriving at its point. Voss looked at him. His wrist was in Damien's grip and his face was showing for the first time something without a mask over it. "You understand," Voss said, his voice still even, still controlled, an instrument he was playing through what appeared to be genuine difficulty, "that this doesn't end here." "No," Damien said, "it doesn't." He looked at Evelyn across the room, across the length of the curved table, and the 41 people, and the documents, and the evidence, and the years of damage between them. She was already on her phone. Her eyes came up and found his, and she gave him a single nod. Compact, precise. The nod of someone who has just confirmed that the last piece is in place. And Damien felt something in his chest shift, something that had been in the wrong position for a long time moving towards something closer to right. Then every door in the room opened at once. And the 22 black Royces that had arrived at Blackwood Manor in the rain 36 hours ago were not, as it turned out, the full extent of what Evelyn Sterling could put in motion when she decided it was time. They came through every door simultaneously, not consortium operatives this time, or not only consortium operatives. The people who came through the doors of the Lindqvist compound summit room were a specific kind of person that Damien recognized before he could identify the credentials. Federal investigators, 3 of them in the lead with the particular walk of people who have warrants in their hands and have been waiting for the right moment to use them, followed by international oversight officials whose presence in this location at this moment was not coincidental and had not been arranged in the last 12 hours. Evelyn had made calls on the drive that Damien hadn't fully heard. He understood them now. Voss understood them too. Damien felt it in the wrist he was still holding. A single involuntary tension, the body's honest response when the mind is still performing composure. And then Voss did something that Damien would think about later, in quieter moments. He relaxed. Not collapsed. Not surrendered in any visible, dramatic way. He simply released. The tension went out of him like air from something that had been inflated too long. And what remained was a 71-year-old man with a face that had stopped performing and was just a face. "Let go of my wrist," Voss said. Damien let go. Voss straightened his jacket with two precise movements, looked at the federal investigator now standing 4 feet from him, and said, "I'll need to speak with my attorneys before any conversation occurs." "That's your right," the investigator said. She was a woman in her mid-40s with the expression of someone who has spent a career waiting for a particular file to ripen, and this was the face she made when it finally did. "Raymond Voss, you are being detained pending formal charges related to financial fraud, criminal conspiracy, and procurement of violence. Your attorneys have already been notified." She said it the way you say something you've rehearsed because you wanted to say it correctly when the moment came. Voss was escorted from the room without further comment. He walked with the dignity of a man who has decided that dignity is the only thing remaining to him and is going to maintain it at any cost, and the door closed behind him. And Raymond Voss, the architect, the patient, and invisible and 71-year-old center of 14 years of constructed destruction, was gone from the room. The 41 people at the curved table had not moved. They sat with their files in front of them, and their phones in their hands, and the particular frozen quality of people who have just watched the ceiling of a very large room stop falling 6 inches above their heads, and are not yet sure it stopped. Evelyn crossed the room. She moved to the head of the table, the place where Voss had been standing, and she stood there and looked at 41 faces, and nobody spoke, because she had the room in the same way that a change in atmospheric pressure has a room, something you feel before you can articulate it. "You were leveraged," she said, "not raised, not performative, just clear. Every one of you was brought here under the weight of something Voss held, and every one of you made choices under that weight that you will have to account for in your own way, in your own time." A pause. "That's not something I can resolve for you tonight." Another pause, shorter. "What I can tell you is that the documents in front of you are the originals. There are no copies in Voss's possession. What he held over you is in your hands, and what you do with that is yours." One of the 41, a heavy-set man in his 60s at the far end of the table, with the weathered look of someone who had been in difficult rooms before, said, "And what do you want from us?" Evelyn looked at him. "Nothing tonight," she said. "Tonight I want you to go home." The room began to move. Slowly at first, then with the gathering momentum of people who have been stationary too long and are ready to be anywhere else. Files were gathered, phones were put away. Conversations started in low voices that Evelyn didn't try to hear because they weren't meant for her, and she knew it, and she gave people their privacy with the natural ease of someone who understood the value of it from years of wanting it herself. Damien stood near the door and watched her work the room's exit. Not the exit itself, but the human logistics of it. The small acknowledgments and precise non-commitments that allowed 41 people to leave with their dignity intact, while understanding completely that the landscape had changed. He watched her do it and thought about the woman Marcus Hale had spent 11 years calling a liability, and felt the particular nausea of a man who has believed a lie for so long that he can't fully separate where the lie ends and his own failure of attention begins. It took 37 minutes for the summit room to empty. When the last attendee left, there were 4 people remaining: Damien, Evelyn, Saul, and a woman from Evelyn's team named Petra, who had been running communications through the entire operation and who now sat at the corner of the curved table looking like someone who had been running at full speed for 24 hours and had only just been told she could stop. Saul looked at Damien, a look that asked a question without words. The question being something like, "Are you all right?" compressed into a single glance, with the subtext of a man who wasn't sure that was the right question, but didn't have a better one. Damien gave him a short nod that was not entirely truthful, but was the best available answer. "Rourke," Evelyn said. She was looking at Petra. Petra checked her screen. "Compound's east wing. 2 of ours have him contained. He hasn't tried to move." "He knew the exit was sealed," Evelyn said. Not a question. "He had to have," Petra said. "He just sat down and waited. Our people said he was reading something on his phone when they got to him. Didn't look up right away." Something moved in Evelyn's face at that. Something that took effort to contain. She said, "I'll go." "Evelyn?" Damien started. "I'll go," she said again, and this time the repetition had a quality that closed the subject, and Damien closed it. She was gone for 44 minutes. Damien waited in the summit room. He sat at the curved table in one of the middle seats, not the head, not anywhere that made a statement. And he sat with his hands loose in front of him and his knee aching and the exhaustion of the last 36 hours settling into him with the comprehensive weight of something that had been held off by necessity and was now arriving all at once. Saul sat across from him. For the first 20 minutes, neither of them said anything. Then Saul said quietly, "She's something else." "Yes," Damien said. "I've worked for you 11 years, Saul said. I've been in a lot of rooms. I've never seen anyone run an operation like that." Damien looked at his hands. "Neither have I." Another silence. Then, "What happens now? With the organization?" "We clean it," Damien said, "top to bottom. Anyone Crane touched, anyone who knew what Marcus was doing and stayed quiet, anyone who moved assets for Voss without asking why." He paused. "It's going to be a smaller organization when we're done." "Smaller, but clean." "That's the idea." Saul nodded slowly, processing, the way he processed things, steadily, without drama. "And Marcus." Damien had thought about Marcus. He'd thought about Marcus for the better part of 36 hours, between all the other things that had demanded thinking about. The conclusion he'd arrived at was not a simple one, and was not comfortable, and was not something he was prepared to discuss in a summit room at 5 in the afternoon while Evelyn was 40 meters away dealing with her own version of betrayal. "Marcus cooperates fully with the investigators," he said. "Everything he knows about the network, the timeline, the contacts, everything." A pause. "After that, it's not my decision." Saul accepted that without comment. Evelyn came back at 5:47. She came through the door at her normal pace and crossed the room and sat down, not at the head of the table, at the side, 3 seats down from Damien, and she put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. She didn't speak for a moment. Petra left quietly, and Saul followed her, with the instincts of people who can read when a room needs to be smaller. "He said he did it because he believed the consortium was becoming something it wasn't designed to be," Evelyn said. Her voice had a different texture in it now, not the operational precision of the last 36 hours, but something rawer, like ground that's been turned over and isn't settled yet. "He said I was too. He said I'd made the organization too personal, that the 7 years I spent inside a syndicate had changed my judgment, that I was protecting an individual instead of protecting the institution's principles." She paused. "He didn't say it as an excuse, he said it as an explanation. He seemed to think there was a distinction." Damien said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say, and he knew it. "He was with me for 6 years, she said. I trusted him with things that I trusted no one else with. Not out of naivety. I built the trust carefully. I verified it repeatedly. I didn't trust him because I liked him. I trusted him because the evidence consistently supported it." She stopped. "And he still—" She stopped again. "People disappoint the evidence," Damien said. She looked at him. A look that was sharp at first, reading for irony, and then something shifted in it. "Yes," she said. "They do." The sun was getting low outside the ocean-facing windows. The light came in at the angle that late afternoon makes on a coast. Long and golden and completely indifferent to what had just happened in the room, it was illuminating. Outside, the sound of the ocean, which had been present the entire time, and which nobody had been in a position to hear. "The consortium's board will want a full account," Evelyn said. She was back in her operational mode now, but quieter, running at a lower frequency, like a machine that's been pushed to its limit and is still functioning but with audible effort. "There will be a period of internal review. Rourke's access has to be assessed at every level. Every decision he was part of in the last 8 months has to be re-examined for contamination." She exhaled through her nose. "It's going to be a significant period." "How long?" Damien said. "Months. Possibly longer." She paused. "The investigators will want to speak with me about Voss's operation, about the evidence chain, about everything that was moved through the Hargrove Trust. That process alone will take—" She stopped herself, looked at the window. "I'm tired," she said, like it surprised her, like she'd forgotten it was possible to be tired and had just remembered. "Evelyn," Damien said. She looked at him. He had been trying to find the right words for 36 hours, had been trying and failing and setting it aside for the next urgent thing and then the next one, until the urgent things were done and the words were still unformed. He sat with the inadequacy of that for a moment. And then he did the thing he'd spent too much of his life avoiding. He set the inadequacy aside and spoke anyway. "I spent 7 years making decisions about you based on what other people told me," he said. "I knew you. I had 7 years of knowing you, and I still chose to listen to people who didn't know you at all because they told me what I was already half afraid was true." He paused. "I don't have a way to make that correctable. I understand that. I'm not asking for anything. I just need you to know that I know what I did." She held his gaze. She didn't look away, and she didn't rush to fill the space he'd created. And after a moment she said, "What were you afraid was true?" He thought about that. It was the kind of question he'd normally redirect, deflect with something tactical, something that moved the conversation onto ground he could manage. He didn't. "That you were better than me," he said. "Not morally, just in the ways that matter in this world. Smarter, longer thinking, more capable of exactly the kind of patience and strategy that built everything I thought I'd built." He paused. "And that eventually you'd see that there wasn't enough in this life to hold you here." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the light through the windows shifted another degree toward evening. "I never wanted to be better than you," she said finally. "That was never... I didn't want to manage you or direct you or make you feel small. I wanted to stand beside you." She stopped. "I wanted you to let me stand beside you instead of behind you." The weight of that was specific, and it landed in a specific place, and Damien sat with it without trying to move away from it. "I know," he said. "I know that now. Knowing it now is..." She stopped, started again. "It's something," she said carefully. "I don't know yet what kind of something." He nodded. It was an honest answer. He could work with honest, even when honest was hard to hold. 2 weeks later, the first of the federal indictments came down. Raymond Voss was charged across 4 jurisdictions with a combined 41 counts, encompassing financial fraud, criminal conspiracy, procurement of violence, extortion, and obstruction. His attorneys issued statements. His charitable foundations issued statements. 3 of the corporate boards he sat on issued statements about their complete shock and their unwavering commitment to the highest standards of governance. All of it was the architecture of damage control, and all of it ran into the same wall. Evelyn's evidence was comprehensive, layered, and sourced from inside Voss's own operation. There was no clean angle of attack. Victor Crane was arrested at an airport in a city he'd been under surveillance in since the night he disappeared from his waterfront location. He was picked up quietly, with no drama, by 2 federal agents who had been waiting at a gate he was supposed to pass through. Marcus Hales surrendered voluntarily with his attorney 3 days after the Lindqvist compound operation. He cooperated. He cooperated extensively, with the thoroughness of a man who has decided that cooperation is the one remaining instrument available to him. Celeste Vane had been gone from the country since the night of the divorce. She resurfaced 7 weeks later in connection with the Voss investigation, named in 3 separate financial documents as a paid asset. She was not charged directly. Her role had been orchestrated carefully enough to maintain legal distance. But her career in the circles she'd moved in was finished, which was a different category of consequence, and, for someone like Celeste Vane, possibly more devastating. Daniel Rourke gave a full accounting to the consortium's review board. He answered every question asked of him, declined to minimize, and at the end of the final session told the board that he stood by the reasoning behind his choices, even while acknowledging that the choices had caused damage he hadn't intended and couldn't repair. The board received this with the collective expression of people who don't know what to do with honesty from someone they've decided to be angry at, and then proceeded to do what needed to be done, which was to begin the process of understanding exactly what he'd accessed and for how long. It took 4 months. The Ashford Syndicate's internal review took 3. What came out of it was a smaller organization and a cleaner one, leaner by roughly 40% in personnel, restructured in ways that distributed authority differently, with accountability mechanisms that Damien had resisted for years and now implemented without being asked. Saul was promoted to a role that acknowledged what he'd actually been doing for 4 years without the title. Breck, the security chief who had stood with his arm half raised watching the convoy arrive on the night of the divorce, was given responsibility for a complete overhaul of protective protocols, starting from the assumption that insider threat was the primary vector and building outward. Torres got a raise and a direct line to Damien that bypassed every intermediate layer. Torres seemed unsure whether this was a reward or a burden and handled it by working significantly harder, which was approximately what Damien had predicted. Damien and Evelyn did not speak for 6 weeks after the Lindqvist compound. This was not because of anger, or not only because of anger, but because they were both buried in the operational and legal aftermath of what had happened, and because some things need time to stop being too hot to hold before you can examine them. The first conversation happened in the 7th week, by phone, at 9 in the morning on a Tuesday that neither of them had planned for it. She called him about something administrative, a detail in the financial restitution process connected to the Hargrove Trust, a question about which accounts should be returned through which channels. They handled it in 6 minutes. And then there was a pause, and neither of them ended the call. "How's the knee?" she said. He blinked. At the compound. I saw you push through it on the north corridor, the old injury." He hadn't known she'd been close enough to see that. "It's fine," he said. "It protests cold weather. You should have someone look at it properly." "You sound like my doctor." "Your doctor has been telling you that for 3 years. I remember." The pause that followed was different from the previous pauses. Warmer. Not comfortable. Comfort wasn't available yet, and they both knew it. But warmer. The warmth of two people who know each other's particular vocabulary and find, unexpectedly, that the knowledge is still intact. "The board reinstated you," he said. He'd read it in the consortium's official communication 2 days ago. "Provisionally," she said. "There's a formal review period, 12 months. They'd be idiots not to reinstate you fully." "They're not idiots," she said. "They're careful. There's a difference." Another pause. "I've been thinking about what you said at the compound," she said, "about being afraid I would leave." He waited. "You weren't wrong about the fear," she said, "but you had it backward. I was afraid you'd realize what I was and decide that wasn't what you wanted. A woman with the kind of background I have, the kind of organization behind me, the kind of weight that comes with all of it. I tried to make myself smaller. I tried to make it easier for you to hold." A pause. "That was wrong. I know that now." "It was also wrong of me to not ask," he said, "to not make space where you could have been larger." She was quiet. He could hear the quality of her silence on the other end of the line. Not empty, not negative. The silence of someone who is receiving something carefully, making room for it. "What I'd like," he said slowly, "is to have a conversation. Not about any of this specifically. Not about the operation or the divorce or the things we should have said differently. Just a conversation. About something else. About whatever." He stopped. "If that's something you're willing to try." She took her time. He didn't rush her. "Coffee," she said finally. "I know a place. They've been open since 1978, and they still don't take reservations." He recognized it before she said the name. The restaurant from their wedding, the one she'd been eating at since she was a child. He hadn't been back there since the marriage ended, and hadn't let himself think about why. "All right," he said. "Thursday," she said. 10 in the morning. I have a board call at noon, so we'd have 2 hours. 2 hours is fine." She ended the call. He sat at his desk for a moment with the phone still in his hand, looking at nothing specific, feeling the weight and the lightness of the same moment coexisting in a way that he had no adequate language for and that he didn't try to translate. The coffee on Thursday lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. The noon board call was rescheduled. They didn't talk about the 7 years, or about the divorce, or about Voss, or about any of the specific content of everything that had happened. They talked about other things, smaller things, the kind of things that seem incidental and aren't. A book she'd been reading, a problem he was working through with the restructured organization that had an interesting strategic dimension, something she'd seen on the coast during the weeks of the review process that she'd meant to tell someone and hadn't had the right person to tell. They talked the way people talk who have been too busy to talk for a long time and find, when the space finally exists, that there's more available than they expected. He walked her to her car afterward. It was a clear morning, cool, the kind of day where the air is precise and everything has clean edges. She stopped at the car door. She looked at him with the look he'd first encountered across a crowded room 12 years ago. The profoundly aware look, the one that saw things clearly and didn't perform its seeing. "This is going to be slow," she said, "whatever this is." "I know," he said. I'm not the person I was 7 years ago, and you're not either. So whatever we're building here, it's new, he said. She considered the word. New, she agreed. She got in the car. He watched it pull away and stood on the sidewalk in the clear morning air, and the feeling in his chest was not the feeling from the night of the divorce, not the vertiginous, too-late terror of a man watching his own mistake drive away in the rain. It was something else, something quieter and more uncertain and considerably more honest. In the months that followed, the honest version of things turned out to require more from both of them than the easier versions they'd lived before. The consortium's restructuring surfaced decisions Evelyn had to own. Moments in 14 months of strategy where she had prioritized the outcome over the person beside her, where she had kept things from Damien not only because the strategy required it, but because some part of her had stopped expecting him to be a partner she could bring things to. She named those moments in a conversation that happened 3 months after the coffee in her working space at the estate, with the same precision and the same absence of self-serving framing that she brought to everything. It cost her something to say them. He could see that. He didn't make it easier by minimizing, because she wouldn't have respected that. The Ashford Syndicate's restructuring surfaced its own accounting. Damien rebuilt it the way you rebuild something when you've decided that the original design had a fundamental flaw. Not just repairing the damage, but reconsidering the architecture. The organization that emerged was one that he was willing to defend in the daylight, which was a standard he hadn't applied before, and which turned out to clarify a great many decisions. Raymond Voss went to trial 11 months after the Lindqvist compound operation. The trial lasted 6 weeks. The evidence that Evelyn had spent 14 months assembling, that she had rebuilt in 3 hours and 40 minutes, and used in a summit room on a coast, while the afternoon light came through the windows, proved to be exactly what it needed to be. Comprehensive, irrefutable, sourced from inside the architecture of the crime itself. The verdict came on a Thursday afternoon. Damien read it on his phone sitting at his desk and then called Evelyn. She answered on the second ring. "I saw," she said. 14 years, he said. "Yes." A pause. "It's done." It was done. Not clean. Nothing of this scale is ever entirely clean, and there were threads and consequences and adjustments that would run for years. But the architecture was gone. The patient, invisible, 71-year-old center of it, was going to spend the remaining years of his life in a room that he didn't choose, which was the most fundamental reversal available in the world they all inhabited. Evelyn stepped formally into the public role of Sterling Consortium leadership 8 months after the Lindqvist compound, at a gathering of the consortium's global affiliates that was the organization's first fully open convening in its history. She spoke for 11 minutes. She didn't use notes. She said things about accountability and about the particular dangers of organizations that prioritize invisibility over integrity, and she said them with the authority of someone who had lived both sides of that distinction and understood the cost of each. Damien attended. He sat in the third row, which was where she had asked him to sit. Not in the front, not at the back. The third row. The seat of someone who is present and acknowledged and not making the event about himself. He sat there and he watched her stand at the front of a room full of people who were seeing her clearly for the first time, who were understanding the full dimensions of what they'd been working alongside or protected by or occasionally underestimating. And the feeling he had was not pride. Pride was too simple, too clean, too much about himself. The feeling was closer to witness, the specific quality of being present for something true and being fully awake for it. She looked at him once during the 11 minutes. Just once, briefly, from the front of the room. The look was not for the audience, and it didn't perform itself. It was the look of someone who is doing something significant and wants one specific person to be in the room when it happens. He was in the room. He stayed in the room. The 22 black Royces that had arrived at Blackwood Manor on a rainy Thursday night, that had stretched across 3 city blocks and made Damien's soldiers lower their weapons and made Marcus Hale go a color that shouldn't be on a living person's face. Those cars acquired, over the following year, a particular meaning in the world that both Damien and Evelyn moved through. They became a reference point, a moment that people talked about in the specific way that people talk about things they witnessed that made them reconsider something they thought they understood. The quiet wife in the rain, the 22 cars, the thing that turned out to be larger than anyone had seen. Damien thought about that night sometimes. about standing at the window, watching the last taillight disappear, with the feeling in his chest that he couldn't name. He thought about how close the whole thing had come, not just to disaster in the operational sense, but to a different, quieter disaster, to ending with him standing at that window forever, or its equivalent, looking at a road that had been empty for years and not fully understanding why. He thought about the sentence she'd said on her way out the door. One day, you'll realize you divorced the only person standing between you and your grave. She hadn't meant it as a prophecy. She'd meant it as a fact, as something she knew and was choosing to name cleanly rather than swallow one more time in the interest of keeping the peace. He understood that now, and understanding it was part of the ongoing and imperfect work of understanding everything else. The 7 years, the loss, the second chance that wasn't a restoration of what had existed before, but something rawer and more honest and more worth the difficulty. On a Thursday in November, 14 months after the divorce, he drove to the restaurant, the one from their wedding, the one that had been open since 1978 and still didn't take reservations. He arrived first, which he had planned, and he sat at a table that he could see from the door. And when she came in, exactly when she said she would, because Evelyn was always exactly when she said she would be, she saw him across the room, and something happened to her face that she didn't control and didn't try to. She sat down across from him, not beside him and not behind him. Across from him, where you sit with someone you are working things out with, someone you are building something new with, someone you have decided is worth the specific and ongoing and occasionally painful effort of being fully present and fully honest with, which is the most demanding thing two people can ask of each other, and the only kind of work that produces something that can hold. She looked at him across the table. "You're early," she said. "I didn't want to miss anything," he said. She picked up the menu, which she didn't need because she'd known it for 30 years. And she looked at it for a moment anyway, and the small curve at the corner of her mouth was not a performance. Outside, the November light fell on the street. The way light falls when the year is ending and the air is clean, and everything that has been broken and repaired and broken and repaired again has arrived, finally, at a form that is different from the original but stronger at the fracture lines. The way things are when they've been put back together by people who were paying attention this time. The restaurant filled around them slowly. The sound of it rose, voices, cups on tables, the particular warmth of an ordinary place that has been ordinary for a long time and intends to go on being ordinary. They ordered. They talked. Not about Voss, not about the consortium, not about the restructured syndicate or the trial or the 14 months or the divorce. About the book she was reading, about a problem he was turning over, about something she'd seen last week that she'd wanted to tell someone, about small things, the kind that aren't small, about the particular, unheroic, irreplaceable work of two people sitting across from each other in the ordinary light of an ordinary morning, choosing, with full knowledge of the cost and without any illusions about the difficulty, to be present. That was all. And it was enough.